Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. The historical trends and case studies discussed regarding 1990s divorce mediation are presented to provide context on the evolution of alternative dispute resolution and do not reflect current laws or specific legal outcomes in any jurisdiction today. Family law varies significantly by state and has evolved considerably since the 1990s. Always consult with a qualified legal professional or accredited mediator regarding your specific circumstances, and conduct your own due diligence before making significant legal decisions. Imagine it is 1995. The evening news is dominated by high-profile legal battles that seem to drag on for years, draining bank accounts and destroying family dynamics in the public eye. But behind closed doors, a quiet revolution was fundamentally changing how the American family unit dissolved. In the early 1990s, nearly 50% of all marriages in the United States were ending in divorce, yet a staggering 90% of those cases were being settled before they ever reached a final trial. The secret was not a sudden outbreak of marital harmony. It was the explosive rise of the mediation industry. In this decade, divorce stopped being just a courtroom battle and became a boardroom negotiation. We are about to pull back the curtain on the era that killed the traditional, adversarial-only model of divorce. We are exploring the decade where mediators became the new power players of the American legal system, and why the strategies they pioneered 30 years ago are the only reason modern divorce is even remotely affordable today. If you stay until the end of this deep dive, you will understand the specific historical shift that moved us away from a winner-take-all mentality and into the era of co-parenting, and how the 1990s mediation boom created the blueprint for every family law dispute handled in the U.S. today. This deep dive solves a critical problem for anyone looking at the history of the American legal system or the evolution of the family. By understanding the 1990s mediation boom, we can see exactly why our current system functions the way it does. We are going to look at why the standard divorce of the 1980s was considered a failure of the state, and how the 1990s introduced a new, albeit controversial, way to bypass the judge. To truly understand why the 1990s were the golden age of mediation, we have to look at the wreckage of the 1980s. Prior to this shift, the adversarial system was the only game in town. You had two lawyers, two sets of discovery, and a judge who had 15 minutes to decide the rest of your life. By 1990, the U.S. court system was reaching a breaking point. Dockets were so backlogged that a simple custody hearing could take 18 months to schedule. This created a vacuum. People were desperate for an alternative, and the legal community began to realize that the scorched earth policy of traditional litigation was leaving families in financial ruin. In the early 1990s, several states began to experiment with mandatory mediation programs. Florida, for example, became a pioneer in this space. They realized that if they could force couples to sit in a room with a neutral third party for even 4 hours, the settlement rate skyrocketed. This was not about saving marriages, it was about clearing the court's calendar. This decade saw the transition of mediation from a fringe New Age concept practiced by social workers into a standardized, multi-billion-dollar industry. The 1990s also saw the professionalization of the mediator. Before this era, anyone could call themselves a mediator. By 1995, organizations like the Academy of Family Mediators and the Society of Professionals in Dispute Resolution began setting rigorous standards. We began to see the rise of the attorney mediator and the mental health mediator. This hybrid approach was revolutionary. It acknowledged that a divorce is 10% a legal problem and 90% an emotional and financial problem. One of the most significant case studies of this era involves the shift in how we viewed child custody. In the 1970s and 80s, the tender years doctrine or simple sole custody was the norm. The 1990s mediation movement pushed the concept of joint legal custody and shared parenting time into the mainstream. Mediators were the ones who drafted the very first parenting plans, a term that didn't even exist in the common lexicon of the 1950s. They moved the conversation away from, "Who wins the kids?" to, "How do we share the holidays?" This might seem standard now, but in 1992 it was a radical departure from traditional case law. Data from this period shows a fascinating trend. While the cost of living was rising, the cost per divorce, for those who successfully mediated, was often 40 to 60% lower than those who went to trial. In a 1990s economy, this was a massive selling point. But it wasn't just about the money. The deep dive reality of this era shows us that mediation was also a tool for privacy. In the 1990s, the tabloidization of American culture was at its peak. High-net-worth individuals realized that mediation kept their private financial records and dirty laundry out of the public court record. This created a tiered justice system where those who could afford private mediation could settle their affairs in a private office, while the rest of the public fought it out in open court. We also have to discuss the neutrality paradox that emerged in the 90s. The mediator is not a judge and they are not your lawyer. They are a facilitator. This concept was hard for the 1990s public to grasp. If the mediator isn't there to tell us who is right, what are they there for? The answer lies in interest-based negotiation, a technique popularized by the Harvard Negotiation Project and the book Getting to Yes, which became the Bible for 1990s mediators. They taught couples to stop focusing on positions, I want the house, and start focusing on interests, I want a stable school district for the kids. By shifting the focus, mediators were able to unlock potential outcomes that a judge simply didn't have the authority to grant. A judge can order a house sold. A mediator can help a couple figure out a 5-year plan where one spouse stays in the house until the youngest child graduates. However, the 1990s weren't all progress and harmony. There was a dark side to the mediation boom that critics at the time were very vocal about. Feminist legal scholars raised significant concerns about power imbalances. In a traditional courtroom, a judge and 2 lawyers are supposed to ensure a level playing field. In a 1990s mediation room, if one spouse was financially dominant or emotionally abusive, the neutral mediator might inadvertently facilitate an unfair settlement. This decade saw the development of domestic violence screening within mediation, a crucial step-by-step process that mediators had to learn to ensure they weren't forcing a victim to negotiate with their abuser. Step 1 of a 1990s mediation often began with the orientation session. This was where the mediator had to de-escalate the War of the Roses mentality that 1980s cinema had ingrained in the American psyche. They had to explain that they wouldn't take sides. Step 2 was information gathering, where the era of the financial affidavit became standardized. In the 90s, before sophisticated software, this meant binders of bank statements and tax returns, manually calculated on yellow legal pads. Step 3 was the caucus. This was the mediator's secret weapon, pulling each party into a separate room to find out what they really wanted, away from the glare of their spouse. This era also birthed the Memorandum of Understanding, MOU. This was the non-binding document that captured the spirit of the agreement before the lawyers turned it into legalese. The MOU was the bridge between a human conversation and a court order. By the end of the 1990s, the success of these techniques led to the Uniform Mediation Act, which sought to provide a consistent legal framework for mediation across all states. This was the moment mediation officially moved from an alternative to a primary method of dispute resolution. As we look back, the 1990s were more than just a decade of changing laws, they were a decade of changing psychology. We moved from a society that viewed divorce as a moral failure to be punished by the courts, to a logistical problem to be solved by professionals. The masterclass of 1990s mediation teaches us that when the system breaks, innovation follows. But as we will see in the next sections of this series, the ease of mediation also led to its own set of complex challenges that the 2000s would struggle to solve. To understand the true weight of the 1990s transition, we have to look at the financial architecture of the American household during that decade. In 1994, the median household income was approximately $32,000, and the cost of a contested divorce trial could easily spiral into the $50,000 range when factoring in expert witnesses, forensic accountants, and 2 sets of high-powered trial attorneys. This created a massive accessibility gap. Imagine a couple in 1996, let us call them Mark and Sarah, living in a suburban tract home in Ohio. They are not wealthy, but they have built up significant equity in their home and have a 401k that has benefited from the tech-driven bull market of the mid-90s. In a 1980s framework, Mark and Sarah would have been forced into an adversarial position where their respective attorneys would fight to prove who was at fault, even in states with no-fault divorce laws, because fault often influenced the distribution of assets. The mediation boom of the 1990s offered Mark and Sarah a different historical trend. Instead of spending $20,000 each on retainers just to start a discovery process, they could hire a single mediator for a fraction of that cost. But this cost-saving measure introduced the first major challenge of the era, the burden of self-disclosure. In the 1990s, the digital infrastructure we take for granted in 2026 simply did not exist. There were no cloud-based portals to upload bank statements. Everything was paper-based. A mediator in 1997 would often spend the first 3 sessions just helping a couple organize their physical filing cabinets. This led to a step-by-step methodology that defined the mid-90s mediator's office. Step 1 was the creation of a comprehensive asset and liability ledger. If Mark forgot about a small pension from a job he held in 1991, and Sarah discovered it later, the entire mediation process could collapse due to a breach of trust. This brings us to the concept of the shadow of the law. This was a phrase popularized by legal scholars Robert Nooken and Louis Kornhauser, and it became the foundational theory for 1990s mediation. The theory suggests that couples do not bargain in a vacuum. They bargain based on what they think a judge would do if they actually went to trial. Mediators in the 90s became pseudo-educators, constantly reminding couples of the current legal climate. For example, if Sarah wanted 70% of the assets because Mark had been unfaithful, the mediator would have to gently steer the conversation toward the historical trends of equitable distribution in their specific state. In most 1990s jurisdictions, judges were moving toward a strict 50-50 split of marital assets regardless of conduct. By bringing the shadow of the courtroom into the mediation office, the mediator could ground the expectations of the parties in reality. One of the most complex case studies from this period involves the 1993 push for Qualified Domestic Relations Orders, or QDROs. As 401ks and IRAs became the primary vehicles for American retirement savings in the 90s, mediators had to become experts in ERISA law. Imagine if Mark and Sarah agreed to split Mark's retirement account in half. Without a properly drafted QDRO, that transfer could trigger massive tax penalties and early withdrawal fees. In the early 90s, many amateur mediators missed these details, leading to a wave of financial disasters that the industry had to fix through standardized training. This is where we see the rise of the certified divorce financial analyst, a profession that grew hand in hand with the mediation movement. They provided the data-driven backbone that allowed mediators to move beyond just emotional coaching and into complex financial engineering. But the 1990s also saw the emergence of the two-room model. This was a high-stakes strategy used when the tension was too thick for a couple to sit at the same table. The mediator would physically shuttle between 2 different conference rooms, a process known as caucusing. In these private sessions, the mediator could perform reality testing. If Mark was insisting on keeping the boat while also refusing to pay his share of the credit card debt, the mediator could pull him aside and explain how that position would likely fail in front of a magistrate. This allowed for a level of candor that was impossible in a joint session. The data from the mid-90s suggested that caucusing increased the potential outcomes for settlement by 30% in high-conflict cases. Let us look at a specific scenario that was common in 1998. The dot-com bubble was nearing its peak. Stock options were becoming a standard part of compensation packages for middle management. Mediators were suddenly tasked with valuing these non-liquid assets. How do you divide stock options that haven't vested yet? How do you account for the volatility of a tech company that might not exist in 3 years? The 1990s was a laboratory for these types of negotiations. Mediators developed the wait-and-see approach, where couples would agree to a percentage-based split of future assets rather than a fixed dollar amount today. This kind of creative problem-solving was something a traditional judge, bound by rigid statutes, often couldn't or wouldn't do. The role of the child in 1990s mediation was also undergoing a radical shift. Before this decade, children were often seen as objects of the litigation, prizes to be won. The mediation movement introduced the child-centered approach. Mediators began using tools like the empty chair technique, where they would ask the parents to imagine their child sitting in the room, listening to the negotiation. This was a psychological pivot intended to move parents away from their own grievances and toward the long-term health of the family unit. In 1995, some progressive mediation centers even began to experiment with child-inclusive mediation, where a child specialist would interview the children and bring their perspective back to the parents. This was controversial at the time, as many feared it would put too much pressure on the kids, but it laid the groundwork for the modern focus on the best interests of the child. As the decade progressed toward 1999, the influence of technology started to creep in. The first rudimentary spreadsheets were replacing the yellow legal pads. This allowed for real-time modeling of different settlement scenarios. A mediator could show Mark and Sarah exactly how much cash flow Sarah would have if she kept the house versus if she took a larger portion of the retirement accounts. This visual data was a game-changer for high-retention negotiation. It moved the conversation from, "I feel like this is unfair," to "I see the math, and I can live with this." However, The rapid growth of the industry also led to a significant quality control crisis. By 1999, the market was flooded with individuals who had taken a 40-hour mediation course and believed they were ready to handle complex multi-million-dollar estates. This led to a series of high-profile buyer's remorse cases where individuals tried to overturn their mediated agreements in court, claiming they were coerced or that the mediator had failed to disclose a conflict of interest. The legal system responded by tightening the rules on informed consent. This meant that mediators had to provide a step-by-step checklist to every client, ensuring they knew they had the right to have an independent attorney review any agreement before it was signed. The 1990s ended with mediation firmly established as a pillar of the American legal landscape. It had survived the initial skepticism of trial lawyers who feared it would cannibalize their billable hours, and it had proven its value to a cash-strapped court system. But as we entered the year 2000, a new set of problems began to surface. The simplicity of the 90s model was about to collide with the hyper-complexities of the 21st century. What happens when the assets aren't just houses and 401ks, but intellectual property and international business interests? And more importantly, what happens when the neutral mediator is accused of being anything but neutral? In the next part, we are going to dive into the neutrality trap. We will explore the secret techniques mediators use to manage bully personalities, and the specific verbal cues they employed to steer a failing negotiation back from the brink. You will see how the 1990s mastered the art of the silent negotiator, and how those exact same tactics are being used today in corporate boardrooms and international diplomacy. The history of how we break apart is actually the secret history of how we learn to agree. To understand the mechanics of how we learn to agree, we have to dissect the most difficult psychological barrier of the 1990s mediation room, the neutrality trap. By 1995, the American legal community was obsessed with the idea of the neutral third party. But in practice, true neutrality was a ghost. Imagine a mediator in 1996 named David. David is sitting across from a couple, Robert and Jennifer. Robert is a high-earning executive who has controlled the family finances for 20 years. Jennifer has been a stay-at-home parent and has virtually no access to the liquid capital of the household. If David remains perfectly neutral, he is essentially allowing Robert to steamroll Jennifer, using his superior knowledge of their financial estate. This was the central crisis of the decade. Historical trends show that if a mediator was too passive, the resulting agreement would often be overturned by a judge later for being unconscionable. The solution that emerged in the mid-90s was the concept of balanced empowerment. Mediators like David began to use a specific step-by-step technique to level the playing field without appearing biased. The first step was the mandatory disclosure phase. In the 90s, this wasn't just about handing over tax returns. It was about the mediator taking an active role in ensuring both parties understood what those returns actually meant. David would not just ask for the 1040 forms. He would walk Jennifer through the line items for adjusted gross income and investment dividends. By educating the less informed party, the mediator was balancing power through knowledge rather than taking a legal side. This was a radical shift in the professional ethics of the time. The 1990s also perfected the art of the reality test. This is a specific linguistic tool used to manage what mediators call the bully personality. Imagine if Robert, in a moment of frustration, shouted that he would rather burn the house down than see Jennifer get a dime of the equity. In an adversarial courtroom, his lawyer might try to spin that as passion. In a 1990s mediation office, David would use the what-if technique. He would ask Robert, what if you do burn the house down? What is the potential outcome for your credit score? What is the potential outcome for your relationship with your children when they find out their home is gone? By forcing the party to confront the logical conclusion of their irrationality, the mediator could steer them back toward interest-based negotiation. Another case study that defined the late 90s was the rise of the high-conflict personality. In 1998, psychologists and legal professionals began to identify that a small percentage of divorce cases were consuming a massive percentage of the court's resources. These were the cases where one or both parties were not looking for a resolution, but for total vindication. Mediators had to develop a new toolkit for these scenarios, which we now recognize as the precursor to modern high-conflict management. They began to use structured communication protocols. This meant that during the session, Robert and Jennifer were not allowed to speak directly to each other. They had to speak only to the mediator. This created a buffer zone. When Robert said something insulting, David would translate it. He would take Robert's emotional outburst and turn it into a functional request. If Robert said, "Jennifer is a spendthrift who is going to ruin me," David would rephrase it as, "Robert is expressing a concern about future financial stability and needs to see a clear budget." This translation service was the secret sauce of the 1990s mediation boom. It relied on a technique called reframing. Reframing is the process of taking a negative, past-oriented statement and turning it into a positive, future-oriented goal. This was essential because the 1990s was a decade of intense social transition. The traditional roles of the 1950s were being fully dismantled by the double-income households of the 90s. When couples negotiated, they weren't just fighting over money. They were fighting over their shifting identities. A mediator's ability to reframe a custody dispute as a collaborative parenting plan was often the only thing that kept a case from ending up in a multi-year litigation spiral. Let us look at the data regarding the success rates of these techniques. Internal studies from the American Arbitration Association in the late 90s indicated that cases using caucusing and reframing had a settlement rate of over 80%, even when the parties initially stated they would never agree on anything. But the real deep dive value here is in the step-by-step closing process. In 1997, a major trend emerged called the durability test. A mediator wouldn't just write down the agreement and shake hands. They would spend the final session stress testing the plan. They would ask, imagine if Robert gets a job offer in another state 3 years from now. How does this agreement handle that? Imagine if the roof leaks next winter. Who pays for the repair? By anticipating the friction points of the future, 1990s mediators created agreements that were far more resilient than a generic court order issued by a judge who didn't know the family. We also have to address the financial strategy of the 90s known as the trade-off matrix. In the mid-90s, interest rates were fluctuating, and the housing market was beginning to heat up in major hubs like Atlanta, Seattle, and Austin. Mediators began to use a sophisticated trade-off system, where one party would give up their claim to a future pension in exchange for immediate liquid equity from the family home. This required a deep understanding of the time value of money. A 1999 mediator had to be part lawyer, part therapist, and part accountant. They would use the 72 rule or other financial formulas to show how a $50,000 payout today might be worth more than a $200,000 payout in 20 years. This level of financial literacy became a requirement for any mediator working in the U.S. during this era. As we move into the final years of the millennium, the 1990s mediation model began to face its greatest challenge: the integration of legal counsel. In the early 90s, many lawyers were hostile toward mediation. By 1999, they were trying to join it. This led to the creation of collaborative law, a hybrid model where each party has a lawyer, but everyone signs a contract promising they will not go to court. If the mediation fails, the lawyers have to fire themselves and the parties have to start over with new counsel. This created a massive incentive for everyone to stay at the table. It was the ultimate evolution of the 1990s mindset that the courtroom was a failure of imagination. But as the clock ticked toward the year 2000, a new phenomenon began to emerge that threatened to undermine everything the mediation movement had built. While mediators were busy helping couples agree, the assets themselves were becoming harder to track. The rise of the early internet meant that money could move faster than a paper-based mediation process could follow. Digital assets, offshore accounts accessible via a dial-up modem, and the complexity of the global economy were about to crash into the quiet, conference room world of the mediator. In the next part, we are going to explore the high-stakes discovery war. We will look at how the late 90s birthed the forensic mediation movement, and how mediators learned to spot a liar through their tax returns. We will examine the specific red flags that would cause a 1990s mediator to walk out of the room, and the shocking reason why some of the most successful mediations of the decade were actually built on a foundation of hidden secrets that wouldn't be discovered for another 20 years. The era of simple paper files was ending, and the era of the digital audit was about to begin. The transition into the digital audit began with a quiet rustle of paper and the hum of early dial-up modems. By 1999, the high-stakes discovery war had moved from the courthouse steps into the mediator's conference room. In the 2026 landscape of instant digital forensics, it is hard to fathom the sheer manual labor involved in a 1990s asset hunt. Imagine a character named Michael, a high-level software engineer in 1998 San Jose. Michael was an early adopter of employee stock purchase plans and had been quietly diverting small portions of his bonus checks into a separate brokerage account that his spouse, Linda, was unaware of. In a traditional 1980s divorce, Michael might have been able to hide this through omission, because the discovery process was often limited by the specific questions a lawyer asked. However, the forensic mediation movement of the late 90s changed the game by introducing a proactive, multi-layered investigative approach. Forensic mediation in the 1990s was built on the principle of trust but verify. Mediators began to implement a step-by-step financial scrub that went far beyond the standard tax return. Step 1 was the lifestyle analysis. Instead of just looking at reported income, the mediator would look at the family's historical spending patterns. If Linda and Michael were spending $10,000 a month on mortgage, cars, and private schools, but Michael's reported take-home pay was only $8,000, a red flag was raised immediately. This discrepancy created a mathematical gap that Michael had to explain. In the 90s, this was done using what we called the cash flow reconciliation method. The mediator would map out every known source of funds against every known expenditure over a 3-year period. This data-driven approach often revealed hidden income or offshore accounts before a single deposition was ever taken. Step 2 involved the deep dive into the Schedule C and Schedule E of the federal tax returns. For small business owners or those with rental properties, the 1990s was an era where personal and business expenses were often blurred. Mediators began to look for disguised distributions. For example, if Michael's company was paying for a luxury SUV that he claimed was purely for business use, but Linda testified it was the primary family vehicle, the mediator would recharacterize that expense as income. This historical trend of piercing the corporate veil in a mediation setting allowed for more equitable potential outcomes. It moved the negotiation away from the fiction of the tax return and toward the reality of the marital standard of living. A fascinating case study from 1997 involves a phenomenon known as the deferred compensation trap. As the 90s tech boom accelerated, many executives began deferring their bonuses or stock options until after a projected divorce date. They were essentially parking their wealth in the future to keep it out of the current marital pot. Forensic mediators countered this by developing the coverture fraction. This was a mathematical formula used to determine exactly what portion of a future payout was earned during the years of the marriage. Imagine Michael had a stock option that would vest in 2002, but he had worked for the company since 1992. The mediator would calculate the ratio of months married while working at the company versus the total months required for the option to vest. This ensured that even if the money hit Michael's pocket years after the divorce, Linda received her fair share of the labor performed during the marriage. As we look at the mechanics of spotting a liar in the 90s, we have to talk about the paper trail of the first-generation digital age. While Michael thought he was being clever by using a separate email account or a password-protected Quicken file, he often left a physical footprint. In 1998, mediators began asking for the hard drives of home computers. This was the birth of digital discovery. Even if a file was deleted, the early forensic tools of the time could often recover the file allocation table. Mediators would hire specialized consultants to find hidden accounts or evidence of a double life. This created a high-stakes environment where the mere threat of a digital audit would often force a dishonest party to come clean. The potential outcome of being caught in a lie during mediation was the immediate termination of the process and a referral back to a judge, where the penalties for perjury were severe. However, the late 90s also introduced the concept of the safe harbor for disclosure. To encourage honesty, mediators would offer a one-time opportunity for full disclosure with no penalties. They would tell the parties, if you tell us about the hidden account now, we will simply add it to the spreadsheet and divide it. If we find it later through an audit, you risk losing your claim to other assets. This psychological tactic was remarkably effective. Data from the late 90s suggests that nearly 40% of participants in high-asset mediations admitted to at least one undisclosed asset when presented with the safe harbor option. It was a pragmatic solution to a human problem, the fear of losing everything. The 1990s also saw the rise of the vocational evaluation in mediation. This was a step-by-step process used to determine the earning capacity of a spouse who had been out of the workforce. If Linda had stayed home for 10 years, Michael's lawyer might argue she could easily go back to work and earn a high salary, thereby reducing his alimony obligation. A vocational expert would be brought into the mediation to conduct testing, analyze the current job market, and provide a realistic timeline for Linda's re-entry. In the 90s, this often meant looking at the burgeoning fields of web design or project management. This data prevented Michael from lowballing Linda based on a hypothetical income that she couldn't actually achieve. We must also consider the role of the 1990s private investigator within the mediation framework. While mediation is meant to be a collaborative process, The late 90s saw a surge in the use of PIs to verify claims of lifestyle and cohabitation. If Michael claimed he couldn't afford child support because his business was failing, but a PI filmed him taking expensive vacations or purchasing a new boat, that evidence would be brought into the caucus room. The mediator would then use this information for a reality test, forcing Michael to reconcile his stated poverty with his observed behavior. This was a brutal but necessary part of the high-stakes discovery war. But what happened when the secrets weren't financial? As we moved toward the year 2000, mediators began to encounter a new kind of hidden variable: the secret life enabled by the anonymity of the early internet. This was the era of the first chat rooms and the first online gambling sites. Mediators were suddenly dealing with cases where marital assets had been liquidated to fund digital addictions, or secret relationships that existed entirely in the virtual space. The 1990s mediation model, built on the idea of face-to-face honesty, was being pushed to its breaking point by a world that was becoming increasingly disconnected from physical reality. In the next part, we are going to look at the psychological warfare of the late 90s mediation room. We will explore the specific tactics used to break a deadlock when both parties were digging in their heels over sentimental items, and the shocking story of how a 1998 mediation over a Beanie Baby collection became a national symbol for the absurdity of the era. You will learn the three-step de-escalation protocol that mediators used when logic failed and emotions took over, and how those same techniques are now being used to settle massive class action lawsuits in 2026. The battle for the money was over. The battle for the soul of the family was just beginning. The battle for the soul of the family in the late 1990s often manifested in the most unexpected ways, specifically through the weaponization of sentimental property. While the previous decade focused on who got the car or the house, the 90s introduced a new level of psychological warfare centered on lifestyle symbols and collectibles. To understand this, we have to look at the infamous 1999 case study of a couple in a Las Vegas courtroom, surrounded by a mountain of stuffed animals. This was the Beanie Baby divorce. It became the ultimate historical trend and a cautionary tale for every mediator in the country. Imagine a couple, let us call them Chris and Kim, who had spent years building a collection of these pellets-filled plush toys, which at the time were perceived as high-value investments. In their minds, these were not just toys. They were the physical manifestation of their shared future and financial savvy. When the marriage collapsed, the toys became the front line of their resentment. The judge, frustrated by the inability of the parties to reach a settlement, eventually ordered them to sit on the floor of the courtroom and divide the collection one by one under his supervision. This was a massive failure of the legal system, and a massive opportunity for the mediation industry. Mediators realize that when logic fails, they need a three-step de-escalation protocol. Step 1 is the emotional inventory. In this phase, the mediator identifies that the fight over the Beanie Babies or the family photo albums is not actually about the items. It is about a fear of erasure. For Kim, losing the collection meant losing the history of the marriage. For Chris, it was about preventing Kim from having a win. The mediator's job was to separate the emotional attachment from the physical object. Step 2 is the auction of non-essentials. This was a specific 1990s technique where the mediator would suggest that if a couple could not agree on the value of sentimental items, everything would be sold at a public estate sale, and the cash would be split. This was the ultimate reality test. Faced with the potential outcome of seeing their cherished items sold for pennies on the dollar at a garage sale, most couples suddenly found the ability to negotiate. In Chris and Kim's case, a mediator would have used the I cut you choose method. One person divides the items into two piles, and the other person gets to pick which pile they want. This historical trend in 1990s mediation created an immediate incentive for the first person to make the piles as equal as possible. Beyond collectibles, the psychological warfare of the late 90s extended into the realm of the family pet. In 1990, a dog was legally viewed no differently than a toaster. It was a piece of property to be assigned to one party. However, as the 90s progressed, the concept of pet custody began to emerge in mediation rooms across the United States. Imagine a scenario in 1997 where a couple, David and Sarah, are deadlocked over their golden retriever. David wants the dog because he has a large yard. Sarah wants the dog because she provides the primary care. Traditional courts were ill-equipped to handle this, often simply telling the couple to sell the dog and split the money, which was a horrifying prospect. Mediators stepped in with the time-sharing agreement for pets. This was a step-by-step process where the pet schedule was integrated into the children's parenting plan. This era saw the first legal recognitions of a dog's well-being as a factor in property settlement. By 1998, Mediators were drafting detailed clauses about who pays for the vet bills and who gets the dog on Thanksgiving. This was not just about animals. It was about the mediator acknowledging the changing American family structure where pets were seen as family members. This pivot in mediation allowed for potential outcomes that saved thousands of families from the trauma of losing a companion, simply because the legal statutes were outdated. The third step of the de-escalation protocol was the introduction of the neutral expert. In 1999, if a couple was fighting over the value of a vintage comic book collection, or a set of 1994 tech stock certificates, the mediator would bring in a professional appraiser. This removed the burden of valuation from the emotional parties and placed it on a data-driven third party. This is a technique we see mirrored in 2026 during massive class action lawsuits or corporate mergers. By outsourcing the point of contention to an objective authority, the mediator lowers the heat in the room. In the 90s, this often involved finding specialized appraisers for the emerging market of sports memorabilia and early digital assets. Another high-stakes psychological battle in the late 90s involved the grandparental rights movement. As divorce rates remained high, grandparents began to fear they would be cut out of their grandchildren's lives. Mediators in states like New York and California started including grandparent visitation clauses in mediated agreements. This was a revolutionary move that anticipated the multi-generational living trends we see today. The mediator would have to navigate the delicate balance of the parent's autonomy versus the child's right to a relationship with their extended family. This required a step-by-step negotiation of boundaries. Step 1. Defining the frequency of contact. Step 2. Establishing the protocol for transportation. Step 3. Creating a conflict resolution clause specifically for the grandparents. As the decade drew to a close, the psychological warfare shifted toward the concept of future interests. This was especially true for the children of the 90s, often called the latchkey generation. Mediators began to use the college savings mandate. In 1998, with the cost of higher education beginning its steep climb, mediators would facilitate agreements where parents were legally required to contribute to 529 plans or other educational trusts. This was often used as a bargaining chip in property division. For example, David might agree to take a smaller share of the home equity if Sarah agreed to put a specific percentage of her salary into a college fund. This moved the negotiation away from the immediate pain of the split and toward a collaborative goal for the year 2010 or 2015. The complexity of these psychological and financial maneuvers required a new level of documentation. This led to the standardization of the final mediation report. Unlike a court order, which is often cold and brief, these reports were narrative. They explained the why behind the decisions. This was intended to prevent future litigation. If David and Sarah understood the logic behind their pet custody arrangement in 1997, they were less likely to sue each other in 2002 when circumstances changed. Data from this period showed that mediated agreements had a significantly higher rate of long-term compliance compared to judge-imposed orders. However, as 1999 turned into the year 2000, a new psychological stressor entered the room: the fear of the unknown. The Y2K bug was a metaphor for the anxiety of the era. People were worried that their financial records would vanish, that their bank accounts would reset, and that the world as they knew it was ending. This global anxiety seeped into the mediation room, making couples more risk-averse and more prone to hoarding liquid assets. Mediators had to become amateur historians and tech consultants just to keep people calm enough to sign a document. In the next part, we are going to dive into the shadow of the Silicon Valley. We will explore how the tech explosion of the late 90s created a new class of divorce millionaires, and how mediators handled the valuation of companies that didn't have any actual earnings. We will look at the secret world of intellectual property mediation, and the shocking case study of how a single domain name became the most contested asset of 1999. You will learn the specific formulas used to value the future and how the 1990s taught us that sometimes, a name is worth more than a house. The era of the physical asset was over. The era of the intangible empire was beginning. The era of the intangible empire arrived with the roar of 1,000 dial-up modems, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the mediation rooms of Northern California and the growing tech corridors of the East Coast. By 1999, mediators were no longer just looking at bank statements and real estate appraisals. They were looking at lines of code, beta test results, and registered domain names. This shift created a massive valuation crisis. In a traditional 1990s framework, you valued a business based on its past 3 years of earnings, its inventory, and its physical equipment. But how do you value a company that has zero profit, zero inventory, and only exists on a server in a garage? This was the challenge faced by our next character, Steve, a hardware engineer in 1999 Seattle. Steve was going through a divorce from his spouse, Alicia, while his startup was in the middle of a series of funding round. The potential outcome of their mediation hinged on a single terrifying question: what is Steve's equity worth? In 1999, the historical trend was to value tech startups at astronomical multiples of their revenue, or even just their eyeballs, the number of visitors to the website. Alicia's lawyer wanted to value Steve's 10% stake based on the most recent valuation from venture capitalists, which put the company at $50 million. Steve, however, argued that the company was a bubble that could burst at any moment. This led to the birth of the milestone-based settlement. A milestone-based settlement is a step-by-step financial arrangement where the non-employee spouse receives payments only if and when certain trigger events occur. Step 1 was defining the liquidity event. In Steve and Alicia's case, the mediator drafted an agreement stating that Alicia would not receive a cash buyout today, which would have bankrupted Steve. Instead, she was granted a percentage of the net proceeds if the company went public or was acquired. Step 2 was the anti-dilution clause. This ensured that Steve couldn't just issue millions of new shares to himself or his new partners to shrink Alicia's piece of the pie. Step 3 was the sunset provision, which stated that if no liquidity event occurred within 7 years, Steve would owe a smaller, fixed consolidation payment. This provided Alicia with a potential upside while protecting Steve from paying for a paper fortune that might never materialize. The 1990s also saw the emergence of the domain name dispute. In 1998 and 1999, domain names were being snatched up like digital gold. Imagine a couple who had registered a generic but highly valuable domain like books.com or autos.com early in their marriage. By 1999, these names were worth millions. In a mediation setting, this was treated as intellectual property, IP. The mediator had to facilitate a negotiation over the projected future value of the name. If one spouse wanted to keep the domain to build a business, they had to buy out the other spouse's half. But how do you appraise a word? Mediators began using the comparable sales method, looking at what similar domains had sold for on the early secondary markets. This was the first time in U.S. history that a string of text became the primary asset in a divorce, often worth more than the family's 4-bedroom home in the suburbs. Another massive shift in 1990s mediation was the treatment of intellectual property for creatives. As the 90s indie film and grunge music scenes exploded, mediators were suddenly dealing with the valuation of future royalties. If a musician wrote a hit song in 1994 while married, the copyright for that song is a marital asset. But how do you predict if that song will still be played on the radio in 2026? Mediators developed the historical royalty stream analysis. They would take the average earnings of the song over the past 3 years and apply a decay factor, a calculation that predicts how quickly a trend will fade. However, they also had to include a reversionary interest clause, ensuring that if the song was suddenly used in a major commercial or movie 10 years later, the ex-spouse would still receive their portion of that unexpected windfall. Let us look at a case study involving a 1999 software developer named Mark. Mark had developed a specialized algorithm for data encryption while married to his wife Sarah. The algorithm hadn't been sold yet, but it had massive potential. In the mediation room, the tension was centered on the work for hire versus marital effort distinction. If Mark had created the code on his own time using his own computer, Sarah was entitled to half. If he had created it for his employer, she might only be entitled to a portion of his salary or bonuses. The mediator brought in a forensic code auditor. This expert looked at the timestamps on the files to see if the work was done during the marriage or before. This level of technical granularity became a standard part of high-end 1990s mediation. The complexity of these intangible empires led to a new professional partnership: the mediator and the actuary. Actuaries are experts in risk and probability. In the late 90s, they were hired to calculate the present value of future pensions, stock options, and even the enhanced earning capacity of a professional degree. In some states during the 1990s, if one spouse worked to put the other through medical school, the medical degree itself was considered a marital asset. The mediator had to facilitate a deal where the non-doctor spouse was compensated for their investment in the other's career. This was often done through a lump sum alimony payment or a larger share of the current liquid assets. The step-by-step calculation involved projecting the doctor's lifetime earnings with the degree versus what they would have earned without it, then discounting that total back to its value in 1990s dollars. This era also saw the rise of the confidentiality agreement as a prerequisite for mediation. With so many divorce millionaires being created by the tech and entertainment booms, the privacy of the mediation room was its biggest selling point. A 1999 mediation agreement often included non-disparagement and non-disclosure clauses that were far stricter than anything seen in the 80s. These clauses were designed to protect the brand value of the individuals involved. If a tech CEO's messy divorce became public, it could tank the company's stock price. Therefore, the mediation process was used to keep the financial details in a black box. As we moved into the final months of 1999, the mediation industry began to grapple with the globalized economy. What happens if Steve's startup has its servers in California, but its primary investors are in Japan, and its lead developer is in Germany? Mediators had to navigate international private law and the Hague Convention. They were no longer just looking at the laws of Ohio or Texas, they were looking at jurisdictional treaties. This led to the development of the mirror order. This was a step-by-step legal process where the agreement reached in a U.S. mediation room would be filed and mirrored in a foreign court to ensure it was enforceable worldwide. The 1990s taught us that wealth was becoming lighter and more portable. It was moving from the physical world of factories and land into the digital world of ideas and influence. This made mediation even more vital because the traditional legal system was too slow to keep up with the speed of the internet. But as the intangible empire grew, so did the potential for a new kind of conflict. What happens when the assets are so complex that even the experts can't agree on what they are worth? In the next part, we are going to explore the great valuation standback of the year 2000. We will look at what happened when the dot-com bubble burst in the middle of thousands of ongoing mediations. We will examine the recession crisis, where spouses who had agreed to settlements based on high stock prices suddenly found themselves owing money they no longer had. You will learn the specific reopening clauses that saved families from total ruin, and the shocking story of how the 1990s tech boom led to a 2000s mediation bust. The party was over, and the bill was finally coming due. The bill coming due in the year 2000 was not just a financial correction. It was a systemic shock to the very foundation of the mediation agreements signed in the late 90s. To understand the gravity of this moment, imagine a character named Brian, a senior marketing director at a prominent Silicon Valley firm in 1999. During his mediation with his spouse, Karen, they reached a settlement based on the historical trends of that specific year. Brian agreed to keep his stock options, which were valued on paper at $4 million, while Karen took the family home in Palo Alto and $1 million in liquid cash from their savings. In 1999, this looked like a fair, balanced deal. But as the Nasdaq began its historic slide in March of 2000, the $4 million in options evaporated into less than $100,000 in a matter of months. Brian was left with a massive tax liability on shares he couldn't sell and almost no liquid assets, while Karen held the tangible equity. This scenario triggered what mediators now call the Great Valuation Standback. It forced the industry to develop the step-by-step methodology of the look-back provision. Prior to the crash, most mediated agreements were final once the judge signed the decree. However, the volatility of the new millennium required a more flexible approach. Step 1 of this new protocol was the inclusion of an asset revaluation trigger. This clause stated that if the value of a primary marital asset fluctuated by more than 20% between the date of the agreement and the date of the final court filing, either party had the right to bring the case back to the mediation table. This was a radical shift from the traditional legal principle of finality, but it was the only way to ensure equitable potential outcomes in an unstable economy. Step 2 involved the distinction between active and passive appreciation. In the 1990s, if an asset grew in value, it was generally considered marital property. But in the 2000 bust, mediators had to differentiate between losses caused by market forces, passive, and losses caused by a spouse's mismanagement, active. If Brian had held on to his stocks because he was gambling on a recovery, Karen could argue that his loss was active, and that her share of the original value should remain untouched. If the loss was purely a result of the global market collapse, a mediator would often suggest a pro rata adjustment to the entire estate. This required a deep dive into the specific timing of trades and market benchmarks, moving the mediator's role even further into the realm of financial forensics. The 2000 bust also led to a massive increase in case studies involving the rescission of agreement. This is the legal process of essentially undoing a contract. In the early 2000s, courts were flooded with motions to vacate mediation settlements. The argument was often based on mutual mistake of fact. Both parties believed the stocks were worth millions. Therefore, the contract was based on a false premise. Mediators who had survived the 90s boom had to learn how to defend their process in court. They began to implement the disclosure of risk statement at the beginning of every session. This document required both parties to acknowledge that valuations are snapshots in time, and that the market carries inherent risks. By making this a step-by-step requirement, mediators protected the durability of their agreements against future market swings. Another fascinating development during this transition was the rise of the negative equity negotiation. In the late 90s, everyone was fighting over who got the surplus. By 2001, couples were often mediating over who was responsible for the debt. Imagine a scenario where a couple had taken out a second mortgage on their home to fund a tech startup that failed. They now owed $600,000 on a house that was only worth $450,000. Traditional litigation would simply order the house sold, leaving both parties with a massive deficiency judgment. Mediators, however, used a strategy called the debt-to-income ratio balancing. They would negotiate with the banks for a short sale, while simultaneously partitioning the remaining debt based on each spouse's future earning capacity. This was a sophisticated form of damage control that the adversarial system was simply not designed to handle. The psychological impact of the 2000 bust on mediation cannot be overstated. The 1990s were characterized by a sense of abundance and optimism. The 2000s were defined by scarcity and fear. This change in the public's character required mediators to move away from interest-based negotiation and toward risk mitigation negotiation. Instead of asking, "What do you want to achieve?" they began asking, "What can you afford to lose?" This led to the standardization of the liquidity buffer. A mediator would insist that a certain percentage of the marital estate be kept in cash or low-risk bonds until the entire divorce was finalized. This step prevented situations where a sudden market drop could leave one spouse completely destitute, while the other held the remaining assets. We also have to look at the impact on child support and alimony. In the late 90s, many support orders were set at high levels because incomes were skyrocketing. When the bubble burst, thousands of obligors, the people paying support, found themselves unemployed or with significantly reduced bonuses. The mediation industry responded by creating the self-executing modification clause. This was a step-by-step formula built into the original agreement. It stated that if the payer's income dropped by a certain percentage, the support amount would automatically adjust according to a preset table, without the need to go back to court. This saved families thousands of dollars in legal fees and prevented the contempt of court cycle that often follows a financial downturn. A specific case study from 2001 involves a character named David, who was a high-profile consultant. His 1998 mediation agreement required him to pay a fixed amount of $5,000 a month in alimony. When his firm folded in the 2000 crash, he had no way to meet the obligation. Because his mediator had included a step-down provision, David was able to transition to a lower payment tier based on his unemployment benefits while he retooled his career. This historical trend of flexible finality became the hallmark of the post-90s mediation era. It acknowledged that the American dream was no longer a straight line upward, but a series of peaks and valleys. As the decade progressed, the mediation industry also had to deal with the Social Security offset problem. Many 1990s couples were part of the first generation to rely heavily on private 401ks rather than traditional pensions. When those 401ks lost 40% of their value in 2000, the future retirement security of millions of divorcing Americans was at stake. Mediators began using the Social Security equalization method, where they would factor in the projected government benefits of both spouses to ensure that the lower-earning spouse wouldn't end up in poverty 20 years down the line. This required mediators to use complex software to project inflation, life expectancy, and government policy shifts. The transition from the 90s to the 2000s was a period of intense professionalization. The Wild West of early mediation was being replaced by a disciplined, data-heavy field. But even as they mastered the financial risks, a new and much more personal challenge was emerging. The rise of the internet was not just changing the economy, it was changing how people communicated and, more importantly, how they kept secrets. The paper files of the 90s were gone, replaced by encrypted emails and hidden digital footprints that would redefine the meaning of full disclosure. In the next part, we are going to explore the digital ghost hunt. We will look at the first cases of email subpoenas in mediation and how the discovery of a single hidden message could blow up a multi-million-dollar settlement. We will examine the specific tools mediators used to track digital infidelity and cryptocurrency precursors in the early 2000s. You will learn the 3 red flags of digital deception and why the 1990s obsession with privacy eventually became a mediator's biggest nightmare. The age of the transparent divorce was coming, whether the parties were ready for it or not. The age of transparency did not arrive as a polite request. It crashed through the doors of the mediation suite in the form of the first electronic subpoenas. By late 1999 and early 2000, the digital ghost hunt was no longer a niche curiosity for tech-savvy lawyers. It had become the primary method for verifying the integrity of a mediation. Imagine a character named James, a logistics manager in 2002 Chicago. James had spent the better part of the late 90s convinced that his Yahoo and AOL accounts were private sanctuaries. During his mediation with his spouse, Elena, James claimed that his business travel expenses had consumed the bulk of his discretionary income. However, Elena's team utilized an early form of electronic discovery that targeted his deleted items folder. What they found were not just receipts for dinners, but a digital trail of a second life, including flight confirmations for a secret apartment in another city. In the 1990s, the discovery of such a digital footprint would have been nearly impossible without a massive investigative budget. But as the millennium turned, mediators began to implement the 3 red flags of digital deception protocol. Step 1 was the forensic hardware audit. Mediators started recommending that even in collaborative settings, home computers and early PDAs be imaged by a neutral third party. This was not about spying. It was about ensuring that the financial spreadsheet being negotiated was based on reality. Historical trends show that the presence of multiple, unlinked email addresses often correlated with a 40% higher chance of undisclosed overseas assets. Step 2 was the metadata scrub. Early digital files often carried hidden information about when they were created or modified. In one landmark case study from 2001, a spouse presented a digital balance sheet that purportedly showed a business loss from 1998. The forensic mediator, however, looked at the file's metadata and discovered the document had actually been created 3 days before the mediation session in 2001. This revelation immediately shifted the power dynamic in the room. The mediator did not just call the party a liar. They used the discovery of dishonesty clause. This was a step-by-step legal mechanism that penalized the deceptive party by shifting the burden of proof for all remaining assets. If you were caught lying about one file, the law assumed you were lying about all of them unless you could prove otherwise. Step 3 involved the investigation of early digital currencies and points. While we think of cryptocurrency as a modern phenomenon, the early 2000s were the era of the first loyalty programs, airline miles, and early digital payment systems like eGold and the original PayPal. Mediators realized that these stored value accounts were often used to park money outside of traditional bank oversight. A mediator in 2002 had to be part hacker, asking for access to everything from Starbucks cards with high balances to massive stockpiles of frequent flyer miles. In high net worth cases, these points could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The historical trend was to value these at a specific cent per point ratio and include them in the marital pot. The rise of the digital ghost hunt also changed the psychology of the caucus room. Mediators began using the digital mirror technique. When a party like James would insist on a specific financial story, the mediator would present the digital evidence in a private session. They would explain that in a 2026 style courtroom, this data would be public record, potentially damaging James's professional reputation. This created a high-stakes incentive for James to settle quietly and fairly in mediation. The potential outcome of a trial was no longer just a financial loss. It was a total digital exposure. This was the moment the mediation industry moved from coaching to auditing. Beyond financial deception, the early 2000s introduced the electronic infidelity crisis. While mediation in the 90s was focused on no-fault principles, the discovery of intimate emails or chat logs would often derail the emotional progress of a negotiation. Mediators had to develop the emotional firebreak. This was a step-by-step process where the parties agreed to a digital gag order. They would agree that while digital evidence could be used for financial valuation, it could not be used to shame the other party or as a weapon in custody disputes, unless it directly impacted the safety of the children. This was essential for keeping the focus on the future rather than the digital past. The data-driven reality of this also saw the birth of the electronic parenting coordinator. As email became the primary mode of communication between ex-spouses, mediators realized that the CC line was being used as a weapon. Parents were copying their lawyers, their new partners, and even their children on toxic email chains. The mediation industry responded by creating the communications protocol. This was a rigid step-by-step set of rules for digital interaction. No emails after 8 p.m., no copying third parties, and a mandatory 24-hour cooling-off period before responding to a non-emergency message. This was the precursor to the parenting apps used today in 2026. Case studies from 2003 show that these digital protocols reduced litigation re-entry, the rate at which people went back to court after a divorce, by nearly 25%. By defining the rules of the digital road, mediators were helping families navigate a world that was becoming increasingly fast and increasingly public. But the transparency had a cost. The privacy that was once the hallmark of mediation was being eroded. If every email and every digital transaction could be surfaced, was anyone truly safe in a negotiation? This led to the final evolution of the 1990s model, the Privileged Discovery Agreement. Parties began signing contracts that stated any digital data revealed during mediation was, for mediation eyes only, and could not be used as evidence if the case eventually went to trial. This created a safe space for full disclosure. It allowed someone like James to admit to his digital secrets without fear that his admissions would be used to bankrupt him in a public courtroom. This delicate balance of transparency and protection is what allowed the mediation industry to survive the transition into the information age. However, as the mid-2000s approached, a new variable appeared on the horizon that no amount of digital auditing could fully solve. The assets were no longer just in the cloud or on a hard drive. They were becoming part of the global influence economy. We were seeing the very first bloggers and early influencers, whose value wasn't in their bank account, but in their audience. How do you divide a reputation? How do you value a personal brand that was built during a marriage, but will continue to generate income for decades? In the next part, we are going to look at the valuation of the human brand. We will explore the shocking cases where a spouse's future fame became the most contested asset in the room. We will examine the specific formulas used to calculate the goodwill of a professional personality, and the case study of a 2004 divorce that predicted the rise of the influencer economy. You will learn the 3 pillars of celebrity valuation, and why the 1990s focus on tangible wealth was about to be replaced by the era of perceived value. The digital ghost hunt was over. The hunt for the future was just beginning. The hunt for the future required a fundamental shift in how 1990s mediators viewed the human being as a financial asset. As the decade wound down and the early 2000s began, the concept of celebrity goodwill moved from the fringes of Hollywood law into the mainstream of American mediation. Prior to this shift, if a couple divorced, the assets were easy to count: the house, the cars, the bank accounts. But as the influence economy began to bud, mediators had to grapple with the valuation of the human brand. Imagine a character named Marcus, a fitness coach in 2004 Miami. During the late 90s, Marcus was just a personal trainer, but by 2004, he had built a massive regional following through early internet forums and a local television segment. His name was his business. When he and his spouse, Elena, entered mediation, the central conflict was not the value of their gym equipment, but the value of Marcus himself. This led to the 3 pillars of celebrity valuation. The first pillar is enterprise goodwill. This is the value of a business that exists independently of the individual. If Marcus's gym could run without him, that value is easily divisible. However, the second pillar, personal goodwill, is the value specifically tied to Marcus's reputation, skills, and face. In the 1990s, historical trends in state courts were split on whether personal goodwill was a marital asset. Mediators in states like Florida or New York had to navigate the step-by-step process of the excess earnings method. This involved taking Marcus's actual earnings and subtracting what a standard trainer with the same experience would make. The excess was attributed to his brand. If a standard trainer made $50,000 but Marcus made $200,000, that $150,000 gap was capitalized into a present-day value that Elena could claim a portion of. The third pillar is the multiplier of future influence. In 2004, mediators were essentially trying to predict the rise of the influencer. If Marcus was on the verge of a national book deal or a supplement line, the potential outcomes for his future income were astronomical. Mediators developed the Celebrity Participation Agreement. Instead of a one-time buyout that Marcus couldn't afford, Elena would receive a percentage of his future, fame-based revenue for a set number of years. This was the precursor to the complex royalty splits we see in the creator economy of 2026. This allowed the person who supported the brand building during the marriage to benefit from the eventual payoff, even after the divorce was finalized. A pivotal case study from this era involves the 2004 divorce of a rising tech blogger. The mediation lasted 6 months because neither side could agree on the value of a subscriber list. In 2004, having 100,000 email subscribers was a new kind of wealth. The mediator had to bring in a digital actuary to calculate the lifetime value of a customer, LTV. They analyzed the historical trends of how much revenue each email generated through affiliate links and ad space. They then applied a churn rate to predict how many people would unsubscribe over time. This data-driven deep dive allowed for a settlement that recognized digital influence as a tangible, bankable asset. It was a masterclass in adapting 19th-century property law to 21st-century reality. The transition also forced a re-evaluation of the career support premium. In the 1990s, we saw the rise of the trailing spouse, the partner who moved 6 times in 10 years to support the others climb up the corporate or celebrity ladder. Mediators began using the reimbursement alimony model. This wasn't about a permanent monthly check. It was a step-by-step calculation of the opportunity cost the trailing spouse incurred. If Elena had given up a promising legal career to manage Marcus's branding and travel, the mediator would calculate her lost wages over that decade, adjusted for inflation and interest. This ensured that the perceived value Marcus now enjoyed was recognized as a joint investment. Another high-stakes scenario that emerged in late 1990s and early 2000s mediation was the right of publicity. This legal concept prevents others from using your name or likeness for profit without permission. In a divorce, if the couple's brand was their joint identity, think of early home renovation duos or fitness couples, the mediator had to negotiate a likeness licensing agreement. Who gets to keep the photos from the marriage for marketing purposes? Can Marcus still use videos of Elena in his workout tapes? The step-by-step resolution involved creating a usage sunset, where the images would be phased out over 2 years, or a licensing fee, where Marcus paid Elena every time a video featuring her was sold. As the pace of fame accelerated, mediators also had to handle the crisis management clause. If Marcus's brand value was based on being a family man, a messy public divorce could destroy the very asset they were trying to divide. This led to the creation of the mutual shielding protocol. The parties would agree to a total media blackout during the mediation process. Any leak to the press by either party would trigger a massive financial penalty, often a preset percentage of the final settlement. This ensured that both parties had a financial incentive to maintain the perceived value of the brand until the deal was signed. Historical trends show that these clauses were the only reason many high-profile 90s divorces stayed out of the tabloids until the very end. Data from the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers during this period indicated a 35% increase in the use of neutral brand appraisers in mediation. This professionalization meant that mediators were no longer just looking at the past, they were becoming speculators on the future. They were asking questions like, is this person's fame a bubble? What is the potential outcome if their platform changes its algorithm? In 2004, this meant worrying about MySpace or early Google search rankings. By 2026, these same formulas are used to divide TikTok accounts and YouTube channels. The 1990s provided the blueprint for the valuation of the human ego. The complexity of these perceived value cases led to the final professional merger of the era: the mediator and the publicist. Mediators realized that a successful settlement often required a coordinated public statement. They would spend hours in the caucus room not just on numbers, but on the wording of the press release. The goal was to preserve the goodwill for both parties so they could continue to earn in their post-divorce lives. This was the ultimate realization of 1990s mediation, that the best settlement is one that allows both parties to maintain their earning power. But as the human brand became a divisible asset, it raised a chilling ethical question. If we can value a person's future fame and reputation, have we turned the individual back into a piece of property? As we moved toward 2005, the mediation industry began to grapple with the indenture trap, the fear that high future participation agreements were essentially forcing ex-spouses to keep working just to pay off their divorce settlements. This tension would define the next decade of family law. In the final part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the legacy of the 1990s. We will explore how the techniques we have discussed, from the Beanie Baby auctions to the digital ghost hunts, created the modern 2026 legal landscape. We will examine the one perfect clause that every 90s mediator swore by, and the shocking story of a 1999 agreement that is still being litigated today because of a single missing comma. You will see the final summary of the 100-year shift in American divorce and the one thing that no mediator, no matter how skilled, has ever been able to fix. The deep dive is almost complete. The verdict on the 90s is about to be delivered. The verdict on the 1990s divorce mediation boom is that it was not merely a change in legal procedure, but a fundamental rewiring of the American social contract. To understand the legacy we live with in 2026, we must look at the one perfect clause that emerged from this era: the future dispute resolution provision. By 1999, seasoned mediators realized that the biggest threat to a settlement was not the present, but the inevitable friction of the future. This clause, which is now standard in almost every family law agreement in the United States, mandates that parties must return to mediation before they are allowed to file a new motion in court. This created a self-sustaining ecosystem of conflict resolution. Imagine a character named Robert, who divorced in 1998. In 2005, when his ex-spouse wanted to move across the country with their teenage children, Robert didn't have to hire a litigation team immediately. His 1990s agreement forced them back into a conference room first. This single sentence has saved the U.S. court system billions of dollars in administrative costs and prevented millions of hours of adversarial testimony. However, the 1990s also left us with the cautionary tale of the missing comma case study. In a high-profile 1999 mediation involving a massive real estate portfolio in Florida, a poorly drafted settlement agreement regarding the division of future rental income became a legal nightmare. The agreement stated that the husband would pay a percentage of the net income from properties A, B, and C until they were sold or the wife remarried. Because of a misplaced punctuation mark, the court spent a decade debating whether the remarriage trigger applied to all properties or just property C. This taught the mediation industry the step-by-step necessity of the Scrivener's review. By the end of the decade, the professional standard shifted so that every mediated agreement had to be reviewed by two independent review attorneys, specifically to look for linguistic ambiguities. This professionalized the industry, moving it away from the handshake and a prayer model of the late 1980s. To see the 100-year shift in perspective, we have to compare the 1920s to the 2020s through the lens of the 1990s. In 1926, divorce was a matter of public shame and required proof of a moral failing like adultery or cruelty. By 1996, the mediation movement had successfully rebranded divorce as a corporate reorganization of a family unit. This was the era of the no-fault synthesis. Mediators argued that if the law didn't care whose fault it was, the negotiation shouldn't either. This historical trend allowed for the potential outcome of civilized dissolution, but it also introduced the concept of the disposable marriage. Critics in the late 90s argued that by making divorce cheaper and more efficient through mediation, the state was inadvertently encouraging the breakdown of the nuclear family. Yet, data from that era showed that the divorce rate actually began to stabilize and even dip slightly in the late 90s, suggesting that mediation was a response to a societal shift, not the cause of it. The one thing that no mediator, no matter how skilled, has ever been able to fix is the grief lag. This is the psychological phenomenon where one spouse is emotionally ready to settle, often the one who initiated the split, while the other is still in the denial or anger phase of the grieving process. In the 1990s, the best mediators developed the bifurcated process to handle this. Step 1 was the emotional cooling period, where the mediator would intentionally slow down the financial negotiations to allow the grieving spouse to catch up emotionally. Step 2 was the interim agreement, a temporary holding pattern regarding bills and custody that provided stability without forcing a final, permanent decision. Step 3 was the final push, only conducted once the power imbalance of grief had leveled out. This recognized that you cannot negotiate a logical financial contract with someone in the middle of a biological stress response. Let us look at a 2026 reality that was birthed in a 1994 mediation room: the co-parenting app. In the mid-90s, mediators were literally hand-drawing calendars with colored markers to show parents how they would share time. They were creating the rules for virtual visitation via the first generation of cell phones and pagers. Today, every time a parent logs into a digital portal to coordinate a soccer game or a doctor's visit, they are using a framework designed by 1990s mediators. These professionals were the first to insist that parents should not speak through their children. They developed the third-party exchange protocol, where kids were dropped off at a neutral location like a library or a McDonald's to avoid parental confrontation. These step-by-step safety measures are now so ingrained in our culture that we forget they were once radical interventions. The financial legacy of 1990s mediation is equally profound. It pioneered the use of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order (QDRO) as a standard tool for middle-class families. Prior to the 90s, dividing a pension was seen as something only for the ultra-wealthy. Mediators brought this complexity to the masses, ensuring that stay-at-home parents in the suburban U.S. wouldn't reach retirement age in poverty. Case studies from the late 90s show that women, in particular, saw a 20% increase in long-term financial stability when their divorces were mediated rather than litigated, largely because mediators were more likely to look at the whole-life financial picture rather than just the immediate cash on hand. As we look at the potential outcomes of the next decade, we see the 1990s model evolving into the AI-assisted mediation of 2026. We are now using algorithms to predict fair asset splits based on thousands of 1990s case studies. We are using automated systems to flag the digital deception that 1990s forensic mediators had to find by hand. But the core lesson remains. Human conflict requires a human bridge. The 1990s taught us that the law is a blunt instrument, and the conference table is a scalpel. It taught us that fair is a subjective term that must be negotiated, not an objective truth that can be dictated by a judge in a black robe. The retrospective on 1990s mediation is a story of a society trying to grow up. It was a decade where we moved away from the theatrics of the courtroom and toward the pragmatism of the spreadsheet. It was the era that gave us the parenting plan, the collaborative divorce, and the neutral expert. It was the decade that proved that even in our most broken moments, we have the capacity to sit in a room with our enemy and find a way to agree for the sake of the future. We have dissected the mechanics of the 90s, from the Beanie Babies to the dot-com bubbles, from the forensic audits to the celebrity brand valuations. We have seen how the legal architecture of the United States was permanently altered by a group of professionals who believed that the best way to win a fight was to stop fighting. But while the 1990s solved the problem of the adversarial courtroom, they created a new world of digital complexity that we are still trying to map. The secrets of the 90s were buried in paper. The secrets of today are encoded in the cloud. As we move out of this retrospective and into the modern era, we have to ask ourselves, have we actually become better at resolving conflict, or have we just become better at hiding it? The deep dive into the history of American divorce is not just a look at the past. It is a mirror to our present. In our next major series, we are going to shift our focus from the history of the family to the history of the corporation. We will explore the rise and fall of the 1990s tech giants and the secret boardroom mediations that decided the fate of the internet as we know it. You will see how the same interest-based negotiation that settled Mark and Sarah's divorce was used to settle the browser wars between Microsoft and the US government. The tactics of the mediator were not just for the home, they were for the world. Prepare for a journey into the era of the Silicon Gold Rush, where the stakes weren't just a family home, but the global economy itself. The loops are opening, and the data is waiting.